I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Ballard, Mr. Tim Ballard. Mr. Ballard spent over a decade working as a special agent for the Department of Homeland Security, where he was assigned to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force as an undercover operative, helping dismantle child trafficking rings in the United States and multiple foreign countries. In 2013, Tim and his team of special operatives left their careers and founded Operation Underground Railroad, the premier private organization in the world to take on child trafficking cartels, resulting in the rescue and rehabilitation of over 7,000 children and women. Their early efforts are seen, of course, in the movie Sound of Freedom. Tim is now senior advisor to the Spear Fund, a totally new approach that invites all anti-trafficking organizations and concerned people of the world to come together in unity to end human trafficking once and for all. Thank you, sir, for being here. I thank all the witnesses, and I now recognize Mr. Ballard for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the Homeland Security Committee, it's an honor to testify here today. I'd like to begin by showing you a powerful clip from the popular film, Sound of Freedom.
Oh yeah, that's a old picture. You know how kids are these days, they just grow up so fast.
That's him.
No, I'm his uncle. Get off, put your hands on the wheel. No, I'm his uncle. You just ask him. Just ask him. I'm his uncle.
Hold on.
This scene depicts a moment from my real life I'll never forget. I was working for the Department of Homeland Security out of Calexico, California, and I can tell you firsthand that the only reason we were able to save this precious little boy was due to the fact that they had to take him across the border at a port of entry checkpoint because the border walls compelled them to do so. The horrors a child faces as a victim of human trafficking demand that we take action. A child can be sold up to 20 times a day, 6 days a week, for 10 years or even longer, depending when the abuse began. Just in 2022 alone, immigration authorities encountered more than 152,000 unaccompanied minors at or near the U.S.-Mexico border, representing an all-time high. I believe every member of this committee and people everywhere can agree that human trafficking is a plague and an evil that must be eradicated. Evidence of this can be seen in the response to the movie Sound of Freedom, based on my life story, which has been a surprise box office success and is sparking a national conversation on child sex slavery and trafficking, the fastest growing criminal enterprise on the planet. The conclusions I offer in this testimony are based on my professional experience as an anti-trafficking operator. After starting my professional career with the CIA, I transferred to the Department of Homeland Security. At DHS, I spent 12 years as a special agent and undercover operator for Homeland Security investigations. After leaving the federal government, I have continued the fight against human trafficking, first as the founder and CEO of the organization Operation Underground Railroad, and now as a senior advisor to the Spear Fund, which is an organization that funds and collaborates with experts, organizations, and concerned citizens around the globe to fight and end human trafficking. Traffickers use our southern border to bring slaves into our country for the sex industry. because the United States is one of the highest consumers in child sex abuse material in the world. Our federal agents who work at the southern border are women and men of the highest integrity and dedication. Yet despite the hard work and success, agents on the ground, one thing has become vividly clear. Poor U.S. border security and broken U.S. policy are feeding the growth of human trafficking in the United States. One way this is seen is the absence of physical barriers on our border. I have personally seen how ports of entry were responsible for helping rescue a child, catch a sexual predator, and start a chain of events that rescued multiple children from his abuse. On the other hand, I've spoken with survivors who were trafficked by cartels, taking advantage of the miles of unprotected U.S. border. In one case in particular, a young woman was brought across the border at an area where no barriers or protections existed. Once in the U.S., she was sold and raped for money up to 30 to 40 times a day for 5 years before eventually escaping herself. She shared with me the tragic conclusion that had her captors been forced to attempt a crossing into our country at the port of entry, just like the little boy you saw in the film, that she would have had a better chance of being rescued. But the success we've seen in interdicting human trafficking at points of entry means nothing if our immigration policies allow traffickers to flaunt legal loopholes. Recently, members of Congress sounded the alarm on information that the government has lost track of 85,000 minors that crossed the border unaccompanied. And the New York Times reported that the Department of Health and Human Services has lost contact with thousands of children who were released to sponsors that are now, and these children are now feared of being risk for exploitation. Just in May alone, U.S. Customs and Border Protection encountered an average of 435 unaccompanied minors per day. These children are prime targets for traffickers for sex or labor. Tragically, as a result of this administration's current policies, DHS and HHS have unwittingly become a child trafficking delivery service. This must stop. We must begin with finding the 85,000 missing unaccompanied children, which this administration claims is not their problem anymore. Congressman Smith's Secure Act will help find them by holding HHS, DHS, and the FBI responsible for reporting on the status of the unaccounted for children. The Secure Act will require these agencies to work together to locate them, assess their exposure to being trafficked, exploited, or abused, and to vet adults in their new homes for criminal activity. We pray all these kids will be found safe, but in my expert judgment, a significant number of them do not need to be merely found, but rescued from actual and active sexual abuse. Once we find these children and rescue those in need, we will be in a better position to reform the failed policies and processes that put them in the hands of abusers to begin with. Real freedom is not a phone number in the pocket of a child for an unknown sponsor or a dangerous trek across South and Central America. Real freedom is safety and protection from abuse and abusers for our most vulnerable population, our children, our future. Thank you.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Ballard, you are a former HSI investigator who has investigated human trafficking, correct?
Yes.
Are the catch and release policies of Secretary Mayorkas facilitating the trafficking of people and children?
Absolutely. What's happening is these children are being brought in.
Let me, if I could.
Sure.
So the answer to that question is yes.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So worded another way, there are cases of human trafficking and sex trafficking of minors that are occurring that would not be occurring if these policies were not in place?
That's correct.
We've made it clear, in fact, the Attorney General Garland, appointed by President Biden, admitted in the U.S. Senate that the cartels are using the catch and release policy strategically to overwhelm the Border Patrol agents and bypass them with drugs and trafficked humans. Do you believe Secretary Mayorkas knows there are human trafficking cases happening because of his policies?
I do believe he knows that.
So you believe he knows that what Attorney General Garland admitted to the Senate, he knows that's happening?
I don't know how he couldn't know.
So is it fair to say that the policies of the United States government, and I'm reiterating here, the policies of President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' leadership encourage, facilitate mass human and child trafficking?
I would say yes.
Mr. Ballard, I interrupted you earlier. I think you were going to talk a little bit about how the policies are facilitating human trafficking, and I'd like to give you the rest of my time to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's very disturbing to me because I know how the United States does deal with children. For example, how they should and how they have. I adopted 2 children from Haiti that we had rescued in an operation in February of 2014, and I went through a major vetting process. I rescued the kids, and I had to be vetted, and I was happy to be vetted. Home studies, background checks, fingerprints, over and over and over again. And I was grateful that the United States government did this. The same would happen to a missing child, or an unaccompanied child that showed up by himself or herself in New York City or Washington, D.C. They would be treated like the precious children of God that they are. My question for the administration would be, why don't you treat these foreign children the same way? Why would you let them come in with no vetting, very little to no vetting? And it's not that the number.
To be clear, we're talking about the vetting of the sponsor who takes those children, right?
Correct. It's more difficult to adopt a cat from a shelter in the United States than it is to go down and take one of these children out of the custody of HHS and claim that I'm the sponsor. There's no background checks. There's no fingerprinting. Why would you afford a foreign child much less protection than you would an American child? Yeah, I think it's despicable, frankly.
Thank you, and my time has expired. Mr. Higgins for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like unanimous consent to offer into the record a report produced on September the 6th of this year by DHS Inspector General Joseph Kafari.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be citing from that report during my questioning. Mr. Ballard, do you know Inspector General Kafari?
I do not.
You'll have the honor of meeting him soon if I can arrange that. He's a wonderful man. He's dedicated to his job. And his job as the Inspector General of DHS is to investigate potential criminal behaviors and unconstitutional behaviors from within DHS. And our southern border, 1,954 miles of our southern border, I've walked every foot of it, is 100% controlled by cartels on the Mexican side of that border. And under this administration, you all can believe whatever numbers you want. The number I'm about to tell you is real. We've had 9 million illegal crossings, 6 million undocumented, 1.5 million known gotaways, 1.5 million unknown gotaways. There's 9 million. When I went to grade school, that's what it adds up to. So the DHS that's executing the policies of this Biden administration is directly responsible for this rodeo we see at our southern border. From sea to shining sea, our southern borders. What we used to call a large gathering of unidentified subjects in various stages of disagreement and argument and fight. When I was a cop for a long time, when we'd roll up on a situation that looked like that, we'd just tell dispatcher, I got a rodeo over here. All the other cops on the radio would know what we were talking about. We have a rodeo from the Pacific to the Gulf in our southern border. And DHS, under Secretary Mayorkas, is responsible for that. And the human misery and suffering and death and 85,000 lost children and our own southern border now rated as the most dangerous land crossing border in the world by a highly recognized immigrant international organization. It's insane. So the guy that's responsible for investigating that is Joseph Kafari. He's produced this report just a few days ago and is quite condemning of the Biden administration. So what you think the Biden administration would do with an IG like that, Mr. Ballard, in your experience?
What do I think they'll do with his report?
No, what do you think they'd do with the man that produced this report?
Well, I hope they would treat him fairly and listen to his findings, because I haven't read the report, but I can imagine.
Hope springs eternal, does it not? This the Biden administration we're dealing with. They're going after that man in his whole office. So I'm telling the executive right now, you watching this, we're not going to allow you to crucify the inspector generals that's revealing the horrors of your policy. And I have a couple of questions for you I'm going to submit for the record afterward. But Mr. Ballard, and in my remaining few seconds, can you assess from your perspective exactly what Congress should do to help our agents at the southern border?
First, we need to go find those 85,000 children, and we need to start enforcing the laws that Congress put upon the executive branch, which is to enforce the border. That's the most compassionate, and it's the only compassionate policy for children, is to suck the wind out of the sails of the criminal networks making $14 million a day trafficking women and children into our country. You end it by enforcing the border policies.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I appreciate the indulgence. I yield.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Carrera for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the committee for holding this most important hearing today. Very important. Mr. Ballard, Ms. Cantu, Ms. Snodgrass, Mr. Jeanette, thank you for your testimony. Mr. Ballard, I've had the opportunity to visit a safe house in Tijuana, Mexico, where minors were rescued from sex slavery south of the border. Met an 18-year-old baby girl rescued from a prostitution house just south of the border. Horrific stuff. Recently, I visited the Orange County Juvenile Hall. The #1 reason young ladies were in jail, child prostitution. And so your testimony regarding our nation's appetite for child sex is disgusting. True, but disgusting. Thank you for your testimony, sir. And Ms.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Guest for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ballard, my wife and I several weeks ago had the opportunity to see the movie based upon your life, your experience, The Sound of Freedom. I want you to know it was a powerful movie, a movie that left us with a powerful line, a rallying cry, if you will, that God's children are not for sale. But we know as we say those words, we know that human trafficking is real. Your movie, the movie about your life, depicted the realness of that. We know that there are statistics that show us that the average age of exploitation is 12 to 15 years of age. That each year the number of cases in the United States involving sex trafficking increases. We know that sex trafficking is the second largest criminal enterprise in the entire world. And we know that every 30 seconds a child is sold into slavery. Those are staggering statistics concerning the problem that we are trying to deal with. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you have in your report briefly. You talk about the fact that a child can be sold up to 20 times per day, 6 days a week for a decade or longer, depending upon the age of the child. We know that individuals who are selling narcotics, that those narcotics can be sold a single time, but a child can be sold time and time and time again. You also talk about in your report polling, which I think is important to members of Congress, to talk about the opinion of the American public. What does the American public think on a specific issue? And you say that the American public realizes that ending human trafficking is important, that it is an unprecedented human crisis, and that Americans support closing the southern border. You also talk a little bit about the fact that in the United States that we are the highest consumer of sex abuse content in the world, that we are the demand for this growing criminal enterprise. And then you tell a story about a young lady that you were involved with and helped rescue in New York City, that she had been sold and raped 30 to 40 times a day for 5 years, and eventually she escaped from her captors. And you talk about the fact that that when she came into the country, that she came not through a port of entry, but she came through an unsecured part of our southern border. And then you go to make what I think is a conclusion here, that we have poor U.S. border security, that we have a broken U.S. policy and that we are feeding the growth of human trafficking. And you go on to talk about the absence of a physical border, and that is contributing to this problem. The clip that you showed in your opening statement showed a very powerful part of that movie where you were able to rescue this young child as his captor was bringing him into the United States for the purpose of entering him into the sex trafficking industry. And then you go on and you finally conclude requiring people to enter our border at actual ports of entry is very effective in combating human trafficking. And so briefly, Mr. Ballard, can you talk a little bit about the importance of requiring individuals to enter ports of entry, about the screening that can be done, about the number of cases of human trafficking that could be stopped if we would just physically secure our border and require individuals, all individuals who are entering the country, to come through ports of entry?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Speaking of the men and women wearing the blue uniforms, that's where they are. They are at those ports of entry. They are experts. They have technology. They know what to look for. If a child has their last hope to be rescued before entering into the belly of what is the highest consuming nation on the planet of child rape videos, their last hope will be to reach out to one of those heroes in a blue uniform. Help me. And they will. I've watched them do it. I've been part of it. And so we need border enforcement because it compels the movement to that final point of possible rescue. Why would we not want that? Why would we not want every child to have the last hope of rescue before entering into the great United States and disappear maybe forever? And so that's why. And what's interesting is it's never been partisan. I was under two different administrations, Bush and Obama, and we kept building the wall and building enforcement, and everyone liked it because it saved children. It wasn't partisan. How it became partisan is something that you can, I don't understand. It should never have been. It rescues children, period.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Bishop for his 5 minutes of testimony or questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ballard, I also saw the movie Sound of Freedom. And I don't know if others do this. Sometimes when I see a movie based on supposedly real life, I go out and do a little research and see how close to real life it is. And the most significant finding that I had from going to look at that, sir, is you are, from everything I've seen, a genuine and remarkable hero. There's one hero that surpasses you, and that is your wife, sir. How many children do you have, including the two Haitian children you've just mentioned that you've adopted?
There's 9 in total.
And when you did some fairly extraordinary things, as that movie depicts, and Jim Caviezel, I think, acts it marvelously, they could have put you in it because, they usually get the leading man because he's good looking. You're not too shabby yourself. But, and I say it as an old bald guy, what was depicted in that story really happens, and you really did that, and your family, your wife was committed to it to a level that is remarkable. Would you repeat the statistic about what the experience is of a child who's trafficked, how long that can happen, and how many, just real quickly, because I want to use it as the basis to ask a question to Mr. Gallant.
Well, a child, the ones that we have seen, many that we have seen, they're sold over and over again, up 10 times, up to 20 times within a 24-hour period when they're with a criminal network that's organized that way. And there's plenty of those in the United States.
For how long?
Oh, 10 plus years.
Mr. Gallant, there are all sorts of human miseries in life. You've described, I think, in your lawsuit and the advocacy about it, depicts one that is certainly true, the separation of children from their parents. In most cases, it has turned out to be on a temporary basis, but nonetheless, one that you said is very traumatizing, no doubt. Which is worse, that sort of temporary separation or being exploited in sex trafficking up to 20 times a day for as long as the child, a decade? Which is worse in your view?
Yeah, I mean, Congressman, I am not here remotely to dismiss horror.
Can you just say whether you wouldn't disagree with me that the one Mr. Ballard describes is a much more devastating misery.
A child sex trafficked, a young child sex trafficked is as bad as it can be.
So here's the thing, and I'm sure you would be thinking, because you're very skillful, that as you sit there, that I'm depicting a false choice. That is to say, that the fact that you'd see that experience would not excuse the United States from abusing rights and separating children. And I actually totally agree with you. But you do have to think about the design of your policies, of all of our policies, and what you do and what results that entails. You've said that the 85,000 children that HHS has lost track of, you don't really think they're missing. And I understand your point there too. They just not soon, in a lot of cases, they'd like not to have official contacts. Let's say 6% of them, though, are in a different circumstance, sir. That would be 5,500 people, 5,500 children who've gone off the grid for some other reason. And I suspect in many of those cases, it's the reason that Mr. Ballard's presence here testifies to. And I think, Mr. Ballard, I'd like to give the last little while. I don't know that anyone in this room could contest or doubt your commitment to children. And yet you don't seem to be allied with Mr. Gallant about which is the biggest problem. Can you speak to that in the last minute and 16 seconds I have available?
Yeah, I find it curious the amount of attention on a policy that I actually agree with the witness. That shouldn't be repeated again. But we have something before us right now. 85,000 children are missing because if you understand the vetting process that goes into, for example, an adoption, or that goes into if you find a missing child in New York City or whatever city, what the vetting process that would go into anyone coming to claim that child. If that kid was released to anyone without that vetting process, you would call that child missing, especially when you called the number and they're not picking it up. Yeah, and we can suspect why they're not picking it up. So I think that we have before us a problem right now. Right now, this should be the focus of the Congress's actions.
Well said. And I'm going to take back my last 20 seconds because I want to make one other point that I think sometimes eludes us. The question is not that inside HHS suddenly bureaucrats have been uncommitted to vetting children's sponsors. The problem is we've gone from about 1,400 children to, I can't do the number, to 83,000 a year that have gone missing. These are people who have been, because the system is overwhelmed with the numbers of unaccompanied children that have been incentivized to come. Whether you believe that it is, honorable and humane or not, whether it is triggered by problems in other parts of the world or not, we have designed policy, others have designed policy for the United States that they believe is best. And so children are being sent here unaccompanied in massive numbers, and you make them massive enough, you cannot build a system sufficient to vet them. That is the end result, Mr. Gallant, of the policy you guys have pursued. I have great respect for the ACLU, actually, and I'd get into that if I weren't out of time. But I suspect that we've got to look at our overall picture and where the results have come. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yield. The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Lalota for 5 minutes of questioning. Oh, Mr. Jimenez came in on me. My apologies, Mr. Lalota. I recognize Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just snuck in, sorry. Mr. Ballard, I watched the movie and that portrays part of your life, and it was a very powerful movie. And I'd like to get your opinion. What policies that are in place now are, if they are, helping the cartels, helping the human traffickers to traffic minors and other people in the United States?
Well, we know that what drives criminal networks who are making approximately $14 million a day, what drives them are the very lack of enforcing our policies, the lack of policies, the lack of enforcement of the policies that are in place. Because if you can get a person in and a child in that easily, that's what drives a criminal network. And so we have good laws on the books. We're just not enforcing them. There's another issue that we should be very concerned about. There's something called the Flores settlement, which is well intended. It's a court ruling that compels a child to be released within 72 hours into the United States, even if that child's with their parent. Well, the traffickers are always smarter than we give them credit for, and they've been taking advantage of that. What they do is they'll take these children who are unaccompanied, and they will pair them, and they will instruct them to call this woman and this man, the clients of the smuggler, mom and dad. And Border Patrol was noticing the same kids keep coming through as the kid of the family. And so that's a part of this conversation too, of this family separation. If there are real families being separated, that's devastating, that shouldn't happen. But let's vet it. Again, it's a lack of vetting, it's a lack of investigating. Is that kid really with that parent? Or is that kid being abused? Is that kid being used as a pawn in the game, in the trafficking criminal networks, efforts? So all those things, it has to do with taking children, in my opinion, making them the priority, investigating everything about them and who's coming to get them. That's what's lacking.
You know, it's interesting because when my last term, I went down to the border and to check out what was going on, and actually ran into about 6 migrants crossing the border, a father, 2 fathers, a couple teenagers, and it turns out that one of the fathers wasn't really the father. Later on, they found out they did some DNA testing and all that. So I'm wondering if that DNA testing is still going on to find out if these supposedly parents are real parents, and then we really have a big issue here. What would you do differently in order to stem the flow, of human trafficking that we have right now? Because you're quite right. I mean, the cartels are actually making more money on human trafficking than they are with drugs, which is really, when you think about it, that's a heck of a thing to say.
Yeah.
They're making billions of dollars on human trafficking. What would you do differently?
Well, for one, I would return the rapid DNA technology that was once in place, and the current administration took it away several months ago. I don't know why they did that. I've used this technology. It's like within 20 minutes you can get a positive or negative ID and confirm.
So the administration actually took that away?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
And so we have an administration, and we have and that's saying that it's inhumane to separate families from each other, and yet they don't even know if the people being brought over are being brought by their family.
Right. Worse than that, anyone can show up and claim.
I wonder what the ACLU has to say about that. That's a rhetorical question. Thank you. Go ahead.
Investigate that.
Yeah. Okay. Now, see, now I get upset. When I see injustice, when I see what the human toll that's happening at our border, in the name of politics, in the name of an open border, the human suffering that continues to happen in the United States. 85,000 children, at least, that are unaccounted for. Is that a tragedy, sir?
If the 85,000 are really missing and being exploited, absolutely. But we don't believe that the mere fact that the calls were not answered. And I just want to, if I could just make one point, we are all for when people show up and there's some reason to believe that it's not the parent or legal guardian, for some kind of vetting. And there's lots of ways to do it. It's easy. DNA was mentioned, calling the consulate, checking documents. But what we don't want to see, and what we have seen repeatedly, is just someone says, well, we don't want trafficking, so we're going to take this family away, and then they actually are the parent, and the judge says, well, why don't you do a DNA test? And it becomes clear it is the parent. So I think there needs to be balance on both sides.
Thank you. My time is up. I wish I had heck of a lot more time, because I could have a lot more questions. Thank you, and I yield back.
At this point, the chair recognizes Mr. Goldman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gallant, a couple quick questions for you. Can the Biden administration unilaterally hire more immigration judges to address the long backlog of asylum claims?
I apologize. I do not know all the technical aspects of what they can do now and whether they have
they would need
finances.
Authorization and appropriation from Congress,
right.
So,
absolutely.
can the administration just print money so that they can hire more border security agents, or is that something that Congress has to do?
No.
Okay. It's interesting to hear my colleagues say that the administration's policies are political when there are so many obvious legislative issues that need to be fixed by Congress that the administration cannot do. And unfortunately, what is political about our immigration discussion right now is what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are doing. And they are using immigration as a political partisan cudgel, and they have no interest in actually solving the problems. The backlog of asylum claims is a significant problem that we need to address. Our border security is a significant problem that we need to address. We may disagree on how to do it, but Congress has to do it. So I find it remarkable when I hear the chairman say that this administration, quote, encourages child and sex trafficking. Or my colleague from Louisiana says that the government is partnering with cartels in human trafficking. Mr. Ballard, do you agree that this government is encouraging human trafficking and partnering with the criminal organizations to engage in human trafficking?
I wouldn't say it's wittingly, but I would definitely say that the trafficking networks are using a failed policy to get people and children into our country in a way that's unethical and flat out wrong.
Unethical and wrong.
And wrong.
To enforce our, okay. Let's talk about that for a second. You have talked about the control of the human trafficking network by the cartels, right?
Correct.
The cartels are the ones who are orchestrating this and benefiting from it and pushing it, correct?
Correct.
The cartels, you would agree, rule to the extent they do by force and threat of violence, correct?
Yes.
And they do that because they possess weapons of war, such as AR-15s, correct?
The cartels, yes, they
Yes.
possess those things.
Do you know where the majority of those weapons of war come from that the cartels use?
I don't.
The United States. The United States. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to introduce a July 24, 2023 article by Reuters that is entitled, Mexico Urges U.S. Court to Revive a $10 billion Lawsuit Against Gun Makers. And I flag this because in 2005, the Republicans passed, over Democrats' objections, a bill that provides immunity to gun manufacturers. And what we have here is that the cartels are ruling by force. They're ruling, as you just testified, Mr. Ballard, through the use of weapons, of guns, of weapons of war that are trafficked across the border, but not from south to north, from north to south. And I'm sure you would agree with me that if they did not possess those weapons of war, they would be much less powerful, because that is how they rule. No one here is defending child sex trafficking. I supervise prosecutions of sex trafficking. There's nothing worse. But there is a big difference between criminal organizations engaging in crimes, child sex trafficking, and the government sanctioning policies that separate children from their parents. So let's remember, we're not talking apples to apples here. And let's hope that we never go back to that policy, as Donald Trump recently said he would like to do. Yield back.
Chair at this time recognizes Representative McCall for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ballard, thank you for being here and all the witnesses. Ms. Snodgrass, I'm so sorry to hear about your son's passing. And we're hearing these stories way too much, way too frequently. Yeah, I was a federal prosecutor many years. I was chair of this committee. HSI does some great work. And the movie Sounds of Freedom, very moving, and especially God's children are not for sale. They're not. And what we see with the trafficking is it's one of the worst sins that I've seen in my lifetime, where children are property and they are trafficked. And I want to thank you for your heroism and the job you did to save those children. Problem is, we have more children now trafficked than ever before. Would you agree that this is probably one of the worst human trafficking events of your lifetime? Right now?
Absolutely.
On day one, this administration rescinded a policy that was working. It was called Remain in Mexico. And you know how political asylum works. They couldn't touch base in the United States. There was no catch and release. 85% don't qualify, 15% do, and it worked. On day one, it's rescinded. Guess what happens? The floodgates. And every Border Patrol agent I talked to, I'm from the great state of Texas, will tell you that there was a direct cause and effect. But it's not just human trafficking. Now we have almost 100,000 deaths due to fentanyl, which unfortunately Ms. Snodgrass knows only too well. Have you ever seen anything worse from an opioid epidemic in your lifetime?
No.
What's worse is when the kids get here, guess what? They have no legal status. So where do they go, Mr. Ballard? The women, the girls, where do they go?
They have to be released to HHS, where they wait for any sponsor to come and pick them up and take them home. With no
And a
vetting.
lot of times these sponsors have maybe 15 different children. And guess what they're doing? Sex trafficking. They're bringing it now inside the United States of America. And guess what? Where do the young boys typically go? They don't have a home. Maybe they have a sponsor, but guess what happens to them?
Well, they're exploited, labor, sex, any kind of exploitation is available, and they have no name, no number, no identity. They are the perfect victim of any kind of exploitation within this country because no one even knows they exist.
The perfect victim, both the girls and the boys. And the boys, I would argue, go to MS-13 where they got to pay back their debt to the cartels. This is a racket, and it's sanctioned by this administration. In fact, it was created by this administration. Would you agree with that?
The policies absolutely made this possible, absolutely.
The policies. You know, when I was a federal prosecutor, there's aiding and abetting, complicit with an offense. Would you consider these policies to be aiding and abetting the criminal conduct that we're seeing?
Absolutely, especially since the administration has been told and warned and told again that that's what they're doing. And if they continue doing it, absolutely, I'd say they're absolutely hating and abetting, and they're complicit in this.
And Secretary Mayorkas knows better. I've known him for a long time. I worked with Jay Johnson. He was a U.S. attorney like I was in the border state of California. He knows exactly what he's doing, but he's disregarding the truth. And he won't change the policy that's causing so much harm and destruction to this country. Would you say that Secretary Mayorkas is complicit with the human trafficking, with the fentanyls, with the sex trafficking, with the deaths?
Because I've seen him be questioned in hearings, both Senate and House, and I know that he now knows, because I've seen it, I have to say, unfortunately, yes, that he would have to be complicit in it.
Have you ever seen the death rate higher than it is today of people just trying to get to the border?
Never. It's never been this high.
Because there's so many of them.
There's so many.
Because we're open for business. That's a sign the administration put on the border. We're open for business. Come on in. Come on in. And once you touch base in the United States, guess what? Catch and release. My first bill in Congress 20 years ago, end, catch and release. And guess what? We're back to it again. It's a failed policy. It doesn't work. We finally had it fixed. And then this administration comes in and they screwed it all up. And it comes at a high price. Too many people are dying from overdose. Ms. Snodgrass, my heart goes out to you. My children have been to 5 funerals already of their friends, too many human trafficking cases, and we just opened up the United States to be a big criminal conspiracy network. Is that correct, Mr. Ballard?
Yes.
I see my time's expired. Thank you so much, and I appreciate all of you. And Mr. Ballard, thanks for the job you have done.
Thank you, sir.
This is the site of Ground Zero. We have 100 people every year, the last couple of years. We're now at 140. Those are on the terrorist watch list just for this year, 140 that have been encountered. Who knows the number of potential heinous actors have come across that we've not apprehended. Mr. Ballard, I think all of us applaud you, Jim Caviezel, Matthew Faraci, throw out Matthew's name, he's from Oklahoma. You guys are agents of light and the sound of freedom. What you've done to advocate and what you've done to shed light on the humanitarian crisis of the sex slave trade, thanks for being agents of light in a dark situation. Things that have been talked about today, the second largest criminal enterprise in the world is the sex slave trade. Every 30 seconds, a child is subjected to this heinous act. The U.S. being the largest consumer of child pornography, third largest consumer of child pornography, and largest consumer of child rape videos. God help our country in this cultural rot. Line upon line and precept upon precept, we have stepped away generation after generation from biblical virtue, and this is where we're at. That's an aside. But for every parent who's not wanting to wage in this battle of good and evil, of returning this nation back to our roots of biblical virtue, it might, if we stay silent, it's probably going to be easier for us, but it's not going to be easier for our kids and our grandkids. But now let's talk about those children that are coming across our border illegally. You'd shared with me earlier, the president of Guatemala told you something pretty profound. Would you expound about what the president of Guatemala told you as it relates to this trafficking issue?
Yes, I was with President Giamatti last week, and he was just talking about the horrifying things that are happening to his people. He started a campaign with his government called Haciendo Visible lo Invisible, which is to say, making visible what is invisible. And it's basically a warning to the people, don't go with these smugglers, because most of them are also traffickers. Most of them are abusers. And they might play a nice game and pitch a nice pitch in the beginning. Hey, don't worry, I'll pay you later. Well, you can pay me later. Yeah, they'll pay with their bodies. They'll pay with other things.
Did you tell me that 75%, he told you that 75% of all minors and women that are migrating are subjected to sexual abuse?
That's exactly what he told me. That's his understanding.
So I'm going to continue with that. So we had a border sheriff that told us that cartels are utilizing the sex trafficking slave trade, that are saying to parents, if you can't afford what we're going to charge you to come into the United States, because we've become the Uber service to get into the United States for free, we're going to charge you. If you can't afford it, do you have a 13, 14, 15-year-old daughter that we can help pay off your debt? That's an interesting note that was told to this committee. I think you had said in your commentary, or something you said in the past, that there's $14 million a day, the dollars that the cartel is making. That corroborates another report by the New York Times that says it's $13 billion in 2021 the cartel made off human trafficking. We know there's 400,000 unaccompanied minors that have come across this border since this administration took office. And we've got this massive flow that the administration is not able to vet whether their families are legitimate families or, quote, fake families. Would you quickly tell me what the definition of a fake family is, and quickly just in reference to my time?
Due to the Flores settlement, it's a loophole that the traffickers and smugglers know that if they can get a kid and convince that kid to call her mom and him dad, the clients, you create a fake family. And that forces the Border Patrol to let them in within 72 hours, and they're all released. The kid gets used and recycled over and over again.
So I'm gonna showcase this. I don't know if the camera will pick this up. This is from U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. This is dated May 19th of 2023, reversing under the Trump administration, where we took DNA testing to verify whether or not those young adults were actually with a legitimate family member. This letter says, quote, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection familial DNA contract with certain technologies will end on May 31st of 2023. The testing will conclude on that date. Samples submitted afterwards will not be utilized. So we know that there's a grand jury in Florida that said that there were 100 kids sent to San Antonio, Texas, to one sponsor. What do you think really happening in those situations?
I think when you see that happening, you can expect exploitation. And when you've left yourself no option to investigate because you haven't done any follow-up, you haven't done any background work, those kids are now gone, and they are missing.
Is this administration complicit, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in advocating the sex slave trade because of these type of policies? They're allowing these fake families to move people into the interior of the United States.
I hate to say this, but yes, they are complicit because they do know. I've watched them learn, thanks to C-SPAN. I've watched them learn what's happening, and they continue to do the same thing.
Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Lalota.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your important leadership on this American matter, and appreciate all the witnesses being here today. Mr. Ballard, I'm the father of 3 young girls. My daughters are 14, 12, and 9, and I watched with great concern the movie that depicted your service to our country, The Sound of Freedom, and appreciate that you put your life and your family, set you free to be able to put others before you and your own family, and I appreciate you making that sacrifice for young children that you didn't even know. In a system with so many failures, you, sir, are a bright spot, a beacon of hope, a light that has helped shine on this crisis that America has, that has impacted innocent humans for too long. Sir, you mentioned in your testimony that there are loopholes in our immigration laws relative to this border crisis. I represent a suburban district east of New York City, which is suffering from a migrant crisis right now. The city's mayor, a Democrat, says that this migrant crisis will destroy New York City. Mr. Ballard, sir, how familiar are you with the history behind America's asylum process, specifically that the historic intent behind the asylum process was to provide a safe haven for folks from other countries, to have a safe haven here in this country if they're under imminent danger of persecution in their own country, rather than a traditional immigration or visa process? How familiar are you with modern-day American asylum process and the historical nature of it?
I'm relatively familiar.
If I told you that under this administration, the asylum process is one by which an asylum applicant merely utters the right 20 or 30 words, but has no bona fide proof that they're under an imminent danger of persecution, they're granted entry into our country, they're assigned an asylum hearing usually a couple years ahead of time, and that ultimately around 80% of those seeking asylum, their applications ultimately get rejected on the merits. Would you agree that given these realities that there are tremendous loopholes in how our asylum process is currently administered?
Absolutely. You just got to show up at the border, and there's various loopholes, and you're going to get in.
Now, would you agree that these loopholes that you mentioned in your testimony just now isn't serving the intended purpose of providing refuge to those who are truly seeking shelter from imminent persecution of their home country?
It absolutely is not. In fact, it's affording opportunities for traffickers and for children to be abused.
And that was my last question, sir. With respect to our traditional immigration process, which is usually meant to complement America's labor needs, as in addition to the person or people trying to come into our country, can you describe, with just a minute or so remaining, how the diversion of the initial intent of our asylum process has exacerbated the human crisis that we're here to talk about today?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, our laws are good. Our laws would work. I wish we'd put more asylum courts. I wish we would have immigration reform. I wish we'd put more asylum courts as an attachment to our embassies in the Central American countries, so they don't have to take this journey to those who deserve asylum. Unfortunately, those who are showing up, the vast majority don't. They're going to get in. They know they're going to get in. And again, traffickers are taking advantage of it, making fake families, hurting children that way, letting them release to really anybody because they're not vetting them. They're not affording foreign children the same thing we would afford to any American child who turned up unaccompanied in a city. Why wouldn't we afford them the same? So they're taking advantage of what is a good process, an asylum process. They're taking advantage of that because their intent isn't to seek asylum. Their intent is to get into the United States or, even worse, hurt children in the process to make money.
Well said, sir. I'll say once again, thank you on behalf of the committee for the sacrifice that you and your family have made to make other lives better. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all our witnesses that are here this morning and now this afternoon. As you are all well aware, and as my colleague from New York, Mr. Lalota, referenced, New York City is facing one of the biggest issues that we've seen in a long time. Most recently, the mayor has called for a 5% cut in all New York City department budgets, one right now, one 3 months from now, and one a few months after that, adding up to a 15% decrease across the line in budgets of our police department, our fire department, sanitation, building, our education system, on and on. Those are huge cuts. And I spent a career in the NYPD as a detective and understand how crucial those funds are to really keeping our city moving forward. And most recently, someone has referenced the Billy Joel song about the lights going out on Broadway, and it seems like they are certainly dimming. One of the questions I have for you, Mr. Ballard, is yesterday we held a field hearing at the 9/11 Museum talking about the global threats that have changed this nation over the last 22 years since 9/11. But most importantly, as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Emergency Management and Technology, we talked about how we can do better coordinating federal, state, local level. What can we do better in order to keep this nation and the people who live here safe? And I had to, yesterday during the hearing, was thinking about the hearing today and thought to myself that we could really be posing the same question to the issues that we're facing with our open borders and now so many thousands upon thousands of migrants coming into the city of New York and many Democrat cities throughout this country because they praise themselves as cities and sanctuary cities where they welcome everyone, but clearly had no plans in place to welcome those into this so-called sanctuary city. So my question to you is, what can we do on a federal level to make sure that our partners locally and on the state level have the resources that they need to deal with this humanitarian crisis, with this disaster at the southern border, and most specifically, deal with human trafficking now in these cities where, you know, detectives like myself, it wasn't one of the biggest crimes that you were investigating, but now could be. What can we do to make sure that the local, the state, obviously are getting the resources they need from the federal level?
Well, thank you. It's a super important question. I've been fighting this fight for almost 20 years, trying to make this a priority. The resources aren't given to state and local law enforcement as they should be. That's why the foundations that I have worked with and founded do that. We supplement budgets because we know that it's simply, anecdotally, I can tell you that there's about 5 anti-drug agents for every 1 anti-child trafficking agent. That's not right. Okay, as has been said before, you can sell a bag of cocaine 1 time, you can sell a child 10 times in a day. So let's prioritize correctly, and let's start resourcing correctly so that we can fight this. Let's go overseas and work with our partners. I met with the president of Honduras and the president of Guatemala last week, and they said, help us forward deploy and get these traffickers who are taking our kids into your country. Let's work, we can forward deploy on this stuff. And so there's a lot we can do in that way.
Thank you.
Yields, I now recognize Ms. Lee for her 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this important hearing today, and I thank all of our witnesses for being here to share your stories. This, in fact, is a crisis that we cannot adequately describe by talking only about the staggering numbers of unlawful crossings at our southern border, or by talking about the devastating economic impact, or the failure to enforce our laws. The true foundation of this crisis is the ultimate price that is being paid by American families who have lost sons and daughters, brothers and sisters to fentanyl poisoning or children being stolen into human trafficking. And you being here today allows us to share with the American people the true cost, what it really means when we fail to secure that border. So I thank you all for being willing to share your stories with us today. Mr. Ballard, I'd like to begin by returning to something you testified about earlier this morning. You said that in America today, It is easier to be a host family for a child coming across our border than it is to adopt a cat. Would you please share with us some of the things that should be done before a host family is approved as a safe place to place a minor child?
Yes, thank you very much. Again, having been through the process of adopting children, I know the care that these kids deserve. And I rescued these kids, and I still went through it. I don't see why these kids shouldn't have that same level of protection, especially in a country that is the #1 country in consuming child rape videos. This is not a safe country, unfortunately, for children who are unaccompanied and just walking around without any, a sponsor who's unvetted. And so more needs to be done. You can't just show a document and sign a paper. I mean, literally, you have to do more than that to adopt a cat from a shelter. I've done it, so I know. They need to be background checked, fingerprints. They're not being fingerprinted, okay, the sponsors, unless they can make that exception in the moment if they'd like to, HHS. No, you got to do it for everybody. Background check, criminal checks. Do the full, if they're claiming to be family, bring the DNA rapid technology. It's great, 20 minutes, you can confirm. Instead, they ripped it away, this administration, a few months ago. Why? They're already so less protected. Why do you take the few tools we have to protect these children? Why do foreign children deserve less protection than American children would be given if found in a similar situation?
I now recognize Mr. Strong for his questions.
Mr. Ballard, as you mentioned in your testimony, in 2022 alone, immigration authorities encountered 152,000 unaccompanied minors, an all-time high. Many of these children will enter the U.S. illegally and be put at risk of sexual exploitation. In fact, it's estimated that 72% of those trafficked in the U.S. are immigrants. My colleagues across the aisle regularly use words like safe, compassionate, and humane to describe their border policies. Do you think that the children being sold into sex slavery would agree with these policies are humane?
They would absolutely not agree that they're humane.
What is your opinion? What in your opinion would be more humane and help lessen the risk of exploitation of these children?
The most compassionate, humane thing to do is to enforce our borders as the laws require and streamline our immigration processes. I do think that we can make it easier for those who deserve asylum. And that will thus suck the wind out of the sails of the child traffickers because they will no longer be incentivized.
Thank you. A Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General report found that in response to the influx of unaccompanied children, basic screening safeguards have been removed from the sponsor vetting process in an effort to expedite children's releases. Do you think these views, what do you think the outcome of that would be? Is that a positive or a negative?
Extremely negative. It opens up all sorts of opportunities for traffickers, for pedophiles, for people who want to exploit children in labor. And the bad guys are loving it. Look, the human traffickers that are making $14 million a day love our policies, and that should tell you all you need to know. Why do they love our policies? They shouldn't.
Mr. Gallarant, you mentioned family separation of illegal aliens, parents separated from children. If these parents stop crossing with children illegally into America, would that solve this problem?
I think that the parents are coming with their children out of desperation because they're in such danger. I don't think we should be, as a country, saying we're not going to accept asylum seekers, and the only thing we can do is take them and separate them from their children. So I think we need to have an asylum system. We promised after World War II we would never send people back to danger. And we can talk about differences in how the asylum system should run, but I don't think anybody should be in favor of taking little children away from their parents and using them as pawns.
Thank you. Has your organization ever done a study related to American parents being separated from their children by death because of fentanyl overdoses? Over 300 a day, every day in America from fentanyl. People die from overdoses where American children are being stripped from the arms of their parents. You ever done a study on that?
I don't know.
If a member of Congress believes your district supports illegal immigration, today's a good day to get on the record and say it publicly. I'm sure Governor Abbott would be happy to route some buses your way and bring 100,000 to you to create hell on your city, economy, school system, hospitals, law enforcement, first responders, court system, and your jail system. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Crane for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you guys for coming here today. Mr. Ballard, thank you for your service. My family and I also saw the movie. Pretty tough movie to watch. Mr. Ballard, are you aware that this week marks the 22nd anniversary of 9/11 attacks?
Yes, I do.
Looking back at that event, sir, do you come to the same conclusion that I do, that it almost seems as if we haven't learned a thing in this country?
I do.
Isn't it true, sir, that some of these trafficking networks that the cartels operate, they don't just traffic little kids, but they also will traffic individuals on the terror watch list into the country?
Absolutely, we know that to be true.
Yeah, the last numbers I was looking at showed that within the last couple of years, 241 have been encountered. And that doesn't include the gotaways, does it, sir?
That's absolutely right. Muhammad Atta himself staged in Mexicali, Mexico, and crossed into the United States that way.
Do you think it's possible that of the estimated 1.5 million gotaways that any of the individuals on that watch list or that might be on the terror watch list might conduct another attack like we saw on 9/11?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Ms. Canto, thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to tell you personally, thank you so much for your courage, your dedication to your family, and to the Border Patrol. And I want to say something, ma'am. I've been in this, I'm a freshman here in Congress. I've only been here for 8 months, but rarely do I see a witness that has the courage to actually confront a member of Congress and tell them what's what. So thank you for doing that today. It really bothers me when I see all the politics going on, and I know you've seen it today, haven't you, ma'am? I know you've seen today why we're in this situation where our kids are dying of fentanyl. We have members on the terror watch list coming through our southern border, and our country is, quite frankly, being overrun. You know, it's sad because no offense to the witness from the other side, but clearly they brought this witness in to talk about policies of the past. They didn't bring him in here to talk about what's going on today, did they? Mr. Ballard, did you notice that as well?
I did notice that.
Why do you think that is, sir?
It seems to me a bit of a distraction. Not that we shouldn't talk about family separation, but we're here to talk about this problem right now, right before us, and it's devastating. And I think some of this might have been used as a distraction to not get these bigger points across.
Yeah, well, on that note of family separation, do you think it's a little ironic that there's only a focus on family separation under the last administration?
I do, because there's a point that hasn't been made about that. How come these families, look, I believe some of those families absolutely were separated wrongfully, but however, if the parents aren't coming back to get those kids, how do you know that they weren't fake families that were separated? I mean, we know there's cases where there were real families. I'm not saying there's not, but we don't know the number. How many are fake families and those kids might have been rescued? We have to ask that question. I don't have the answer, but at least let's talk about it.
Yeah, and Mr. Gallant, on that same train of thought, it's interesting to me that you just make the assumption that because the sponsors aren't answering the phone, that you guys don't believe that these 85,000 kids are really missing.
Right. Well, that's based on, talking to people in years of working in this area, that sponsors generally do not like to answer the phone from a government agency or do not know who's calling. But our belief is that these are not children who are lost. And there are background checks. The Biden administration does, notwithstanding what's been said here today, the Biden administration does do background checks. If there have been shortcuts taken at any point, those need to be fixed, and I believe that the agency is looking into that. Obviously,
Thank
we
you.
don't want to give.
I take back my time. Thank you, sir. My colleague from New York, before he left the room, he made a couple claims. He said, can the Biden administration hire more immigration judges? Can they print more money to hire more Border Patrol agents? He was clearly trying to take responsibility off of this administration. And then he said, it's because Republicans have no interest in actually solving the problems, which is ironic. And then he actually brought up something that he constantly talks about where the vast majority of the weapons that the cartels are using is coming from. Mr. Chairman, I have a question for you. Has my colleague from New York ever presented the data to this committee to back up this claim?
I'm
so the
sorry,
rest of us can see it?
I was having a conversation, a sidebar. I missed the question.
Okay. Well, I'd like to know if he's ever, if my colleague from New York has ever.
I think you can ask him,
presented data.
but we can check.
Okay.
But I don't know the question, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Ballard. Thanks for being an American hero and going after those kids. These cartels who capture these kids are some of the most violent people and most dangerous people on the planet. I've seen the videos of what they do when they catch people. And you had the guts to go into the mouth of the dragon and rescue little children. You are a hero. And I hope America's youth know your story and emulate you. It would be great for our country if they would. I agree. God's children should not be for sale. But tragically, many are. And as we've heard today, Secretary Mayorkas' policies have increased the number trafficked and increased the number of dead from fentanyl. And knowing this, he's done nothing.